really delighted to be giving one of the Royal Institute of Philosophy's annual public lectures. I'm really thankful to the Royal Institute, and in particular to Edward Harcourt, who helped arrange the invitation. And I'm grateful to Maeve and to Gillian and to others here at UCD for really incomparable hospitality. This is unscripted for just a second. There is a reason why I'm working on what I'm working on. And you can ask me about it afterwards, but it isn't disconnected from things that I do. That's just not part of my storyline. So this evening, I'm going to be telling a version of what I think of as a really important story about big AI's responsibility for serious social injustices and environmental damage. This is a philosophical occasion as well as a public one, and the particular version of the story I tell emphasizes the complicity of philosophers in these harms and asks how philosophy can do better. It's an involved story with many more details than I can share in the lecture. I'll speak for around 43 minutes and hopefully give us plenty of time to talk if you have questions. And so now I'll start. The term artificial intelligence was introduced in 1956 by American mathematician and computer scientist John McCarthy. AI is myriad technologies that mutate and evolve, yet both the academic field and the industry are said to have the nebulous aim of making machines capable of displaying human-level intelligent activity in most domains. The history of AI is narrated as a sequence of alternating springtimes and winters, in which an approach is supposedly made to this vague goal and then falters. In 2022, the year chatbots based on large language models, or LLMs, seized the world's attention, and OpenAI's ChatGPT became, for many, identical to all AI. A massive springtime broke out with a small cohort of companies securing unprecedented funding, while their leaderships told stories about how general machine intelligence at the human level, or to use the current jargon, artificial general intelligence, that is AGI, was just around the corner. This familiar narrative, which has continued to be woven by AI billionaires, serves to obscure how, in competing to build ever larger LLMs, big AI companies became responsible for grievous social injustices and great environmental damage. Members of a high-profile group of philosophers, long-termists, aided the obfuscation by echoing the idea that AGI may be close and arguing that trying to realize it is morally the most important and perhaps also the most dangerous thing for humankind. By boosting the hype around AGI, long-termists became complicit in serious harms. So this lecture scrutinizes the long-termist tradition as a means both of understanding what's being done to the world in the name of AGI and of recovering the ability to philosophize and act in resistance. Long-termism emerged from conversations about the promise and perils of AI that took place primarily among AI researchers. This fact can be missed because the tradition gets described in philosophical terms as a future-oriented variant of the utilitarian-based philanthropic program, effective altruism, or EA. You need that acronym, EA. Effective altruism, or EA, got its titular start in 2011 at the hands of two young Oxford philosophers, Toby Ord and William MacAskill. It aims to make charitable work and gifts maximally effective per hour spent or dollar donated. And its original cause areas were poverty in the global south and animals in industrial agriculture. EA's youthful originators are mostly represented as being impressed by a famous 1972 argument of Peter Singer's about practical implications of applying utilitarian principles to the suffering of the world's poor, as well as by Singer's 2009 proposal for building his argument into a charitable movement. But this origin story leaves out EA's roots in AI circles. During the aughts, computer scientist and co-founder of the Berkeley-based Machine Intelligence Research Institute, Eliezer Yudkowsky, started or co-started 2 blogs devoted to a tradition he founded and dubbed rationalism. Yudkowsky's rationalism credits decision theory with an apt image of reason, and it aims to improve human reasoning and decision-making so that there are enough smart people around to create and control intelligent machines. Some members of Yudkowsky's online community wanted to use rationalist ideas to determine how to do the most good. And in one of his own posts, Yudkowsky speaks of effective altruism. That was in 2007, 4 years before Ord and MacAskill introduced the phrase as the name of a movement, and 2 years before they founded the organization Giving What We Can and began practicing effective altruism avant la lettre. Even if Singer's work influenced online rationalist conversations about these issues, Ord, who was active on the more significant of Yudkowsky's 2 blogs already in 2009, would have been aware of roots to core EA ideas via debates among AI researchers about moral applications of rationalist notions. Ord would also have been aware that in the heavily tech-populated community of the blog, the main aim of rationality training was preparation to control emerging AI systems. These matters would have been salient for Ord, who since 2006 had been working at Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute, or FHI, an institute partly concerned with risks of AGI. In 2004, Ord was already collaborating with Swedish philosopher Nick Bostrom, who would found FHI in 2005. Although as officially announced then, EA wasn't an AI-oriented movement, it stemmed partly from AI researchers' discussions about AGI-related topics that would preoccupy long-termists, and it would derive its soon evident fundraising virtuosity from its AI ties. Long-termism is, as investigative researcher Molly Lieberman argues, the parent and not the child of EA. In 2017, at a time when EA was taking off, MacAskill proposed the moniker long-termism for an EA-related ethical view that had long been championed at Bostrom's FHI and that Ord was actively researching. The view, which Ord defended in a 2020 book and which MacAskill laid out in his best-selling 2022, What We Owe the Future, the view is that humankind is at a stage of technological development at which we could annihilate ourselves or go on to a radiant future, and that we should prioritize confronting threats that cut us off from such a future. It's part of the meaning of long-termism that a future that qualifies as suitably radiant is one in which, facilitated by advanced technology, vast numbers of humans, or our digital descendants, live on for billions or trillions of years past the sun's heat death by colonizing other star systems. Long-termists may, in theory, differ about the biggest threats to this purported utopia, but most, in fact, agree that anthropogenic threats are likelier than natural ones, and that among the former, the biggest threat is likely machines with above-human level intelligence whose values aren't aligned with ours. In their respective books, Ord and MacAskill represent themselves as breaking from standard EA and arriving at long-termism by applying a future-indexed strain of utilitarianism. These just-so stories about long-termism's provenance omit the fact that views that anticipate long-termism in essentials and provide the immediate inspiration for it were circulating in Silicon Valley decades earlier. The first formulation of what today is called long-termism is in a series of articles Bostrom published in the early aughts. In 1996, about to start PhD work in philosophy and persuaded that technology would render many traditional areas of inquiry obsolete, Bostrom discovered a like-minded, if undisciplined, intellectual community on an email list managed by futurists who called themselves extropians. The extropians were advocates of a modern strain of transhumanism, and their email list exposed Bostrom to transhumanist ideas influential in AI circles. Modern transhumanism's guiding conviction is that genetic engineering, AI, and nanotechnology will enable us not only to enhance ourselves, but to transcend the human condition, realizing the eugenic project of augmenting our intelligence and overcoming disease and aging. Most modern transhumanists believe this will involve merging with the machines and leaving Earth to colonize exoplanets. Bostrom's enthusiasm for transhumanism was such that in 1998, he co-created the World Transhumanist Association and started translating transhumanist ideas into the idiom of analytic philosophy. In a 2002 article, he introduced the category now widely used in policy settings of existential risk for dangers that could permanently destroy the potential of humankind to develop into the sort of post-humanity transhumanists envision. And in a 2003 article entitled Astronomical Waste, he presented a utilitarian case for holding that the expansion of the human population through space colonization is such a great good that reducing risks to its attainment should be our top moral priority. At the time of these articles, Bostrom regarded non-aligned, super-intelligent machines as a significant existential risk. By 2014, he had come to regard such machines as the biggest existential risk and had argued this in a best-selling book called Superintelligence. At that point, having run FHI at Oxford for almost a decade, Bostrom was an establishment figure. He had come close to converting academically disreputable Silicon Valley transhumanism into mainstream Oxford analytic philosophy. Ord and McCaskill completed this project by writing their high-profile books on long-termism without mentioning transhumanism once. This makes it harder to see that long-termism's tenets came from the tech world, while making it seem like serendipity that tech leaders received it so admiringly. Bill Gates declared that he would highly recommend Bostrom's Superintelligence. Elon Musk boosted the book's message in a tweet in 2014, and Sam Altman wrote on his blog that the book was the best thing I've seen on relevant topics and well worth a read. In 2022, Musk reposted a link to Bostrom's article, Astronomical Waste, commenting that it was likely the most important paper ever written, and also reposted promotional copy for McCaskill's What We Owe the Future, declaring it a close match for my philosophy. McCaskill also reportedly had a massive publicity budget for the book, due partly to support from Facebook co-founder Dustin Moskovitz. This adulation for long-termism might have been anticipated because it's directed at researches at institutes for which AI billionaires and centimillionaires themselves provide generous funding. Among the many examples of such funding, here are two. Skype co-founder Jan Tallinn helped found Cambridge University's Center for the Study of Existential Risk and the Long-Termist Future of Life Institute, FLI, the latter of which received $14 million from Musk and got most of its funding from co-creator of the cryptocurrency Ethereum, Vitalik Buterin, who gave it $650 million in 2021. Importantly, the funding of such think tanks, there are many, many examples, leverages not just intellectual credibility, but influence at the world's seats of power. The scope of the hustle being used to enrich a small set of tech executives and their philosophical muses rarely intrudes into general public awareness. There was a brief clamor in 2022 when the crypto exchange FTX declared bankruptcy, and a year later when its CEO, Sam Bankman-Fried, was convicted of fraud and conspiracy, since it was known that McCaskill counseled Bankman-Fried in 2012 to earn to give, that McCaskill went on to advise FTX's charitable fund and that the fund pledged millions of dollars to EA and long-termist organizations McCaskill himself led and advised. The scandal of the 2023 unearthing by philosopher and critic of long-termism, Emil Torres, of a racist email Bostrom wrote in 1996 on the extropian email list, followed a year later by the shuttering of Oxford's FHI, got little attention, though the use of the categories of fraudulent racial science in Bostrom's supposed apology ought to have drawn attention to racism and eugenic thinking in the AI community. The situation is dire because AI tools that aren't properly scoped and tested do real damage, and because big AI is doing great environmental harm. Since philosophers have helped forge the destructive path, it's an occasion for philosophical self-scrutiny and for a philosophical practice able and willing to challenge the status quo. The question of who can best build safe AGI is the framework in which major AI companies jockey for position in the era of LLMs. Co-founded in 2010 by Demis Hassabis and others, DeepMind was the first AI company explicitly dedicated to AGI. Then Musk became convinced that Hassabis wasn't taking proper steps to make AGI safe, and in 2015, with Altman, Ilya Sutskever, and 6 others, he founded the then nonprofit OpenAI to make artificial general intelligence for the benefit of humanity. In 2020, AI researcher Dario Amodei and others left OpenAI to co-found Anthropic in search of a better approach to good AGI. Similarly, when in 2023, Musk, who had left OpenAI in 2018, when he founded xAI, he did so, quote, to build a good AGI. Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg made his own push to build AGI in 2024. Now, preoccupation with AGI makes sense in the context of modern transhumanism. This tradition treats AGI as the path to a utopia in which humans transcend their limitations, becoming super intelligent, super long-lived beings who enjoy super well-being. AGI is supposed to be a step to artificial superintelligence, that is, to computers with above human level intelligence capable of improving themselves and triggering a self-sustaining, exponentially increasing cycle of technological progress. This intelligence explosion or singularity is taken to be humanity's occasion for seizing its techno-glory to come. A major consolidation of money and power is foreseen to be required to build AGI, and central strands of transhumanist thought embed political ideals that seem to justify this. Silicon Valley's transhumanism is mostly libertarian, treating individual autonomy, pared-down government, and the free flow of capital as essential for reaching techno-utopia. These transhumanist themes circulated widely in the 1990s in some key AI forums, such as the extropian email list in which Bostrom participated. One self-designated transhumanist who was active on the list is Google researcher and author Ray Kurzweil. During the 1990s, Kurzweil wrote books envisioning humanity's future as one of augmented intelligence, freedom from disease, great longevity, and space colonization. Toward the middle of the 1990s, a young Yudkowsky joined the extropian email list and for a number of years described himself as a transhumanist. Some of Yudkowsky's extropian contacts helped him found the Singularity Institute for Artificial Intelligence, which is the precursor to the Machine Intelligence Research Institute where he is today. In 2005, Yudkowsky met tech right leader Peter Thiel, who for a while was a mentor and also a key funder of the Machine Intelligence Research Institute. In 2006, Thiel, Kurzweil, and Yudkowsky started the Singularity Summit, an annual transhumanist theme conference. Transhumanism's influence in Silicon Valley, though, reaches beyond those who identify as transhumanists. Thiel, who places Christianity at the center of his belief system, doesn't use the label. but he supported organizations dominated by transhumanists, such as, in addition to the Machine Intelligence Research Institute and the Singularity Summit, the Anti-Aging Methuselah Foundation, and Humanity Plus, which is the successor organization to the World Transhumanist Association. A proponent of politically autonomous spaces for companies to build capital, Thiel was an original funder of the transhumanism-influenced Seasteading Institute and an advocate of network states, or freedom cities. Thiel's most famous mentees are Zuckerberg and Altman, and a transhumanist pattern gets traced out in Altman's professional projects. The same is true of Musk. Contestants in the AI arms race sound transhumanist themes about AGI's importance while debating whether or to what extent it's also a danger. The disagreement gets couched in terms of Bostrom's existential risk. The question is about the size of the existential risk that an AGI not aligned with human values would snuff out humanity and destroy its potential. Those who take this question seriously and call for efforts to solve the alignment project are called AI doomers. Most AI leaders are doomers in the sense of maintaining that at least some care needs to be taken to avoid lethal AGI. There's a doomer extreme represented by Yudkowsky, who in 2023 argued that the US should halt all AI research and destroy any rogue data center by airstrike, even at the risk of triggering a full nuclear exchange. Opposing doomers are accelerationists who favor unalloyed positivity about AGI and other technologies. One outspoken accelerationist is software engineer and friend of Thiel's, Mark Andreessen, who expressed extreme views in his 2023 techno-optimist manifesto. But setting aside the extremes, most AI heads sing in a heterogeneous choir of doomers raising the alarm on the supposedly inevitable technology that they are frantically trying to build while hauling in immense sums to keep it, they say, from ending humanity. The rallying cry of doomers is AI safety, a cause area that includes only the existential risk of a theoretical, vaguely conceived rogue future AGI. This leaves out AI ethics, which addresses harms related to things like lack of data privacy, algorithmic biases, deepfakes, fake news, generated hate speech, and also things like the exploitation of workers doing data annotation, extractivist injuries, and environmentally devastating water and energy use. Doomers' appeals for AI safety enable them to seem friendly to democratic governance while they try to block all but so-called safety-related regulation. This makes sense to them because they believe that, say, racial injustice and related issues aren't, as godfather of AI Geoffrey Hinton put it, these issues are not as existentially serious as the idea of these machines getting more intelligent than us and taking over. Or, as president of the Future of Life Institute Max Tegmark put it, once we're all extinct, all these other issues cease even to matter. Though doomers differ from accelerationists in stressing safety, they also take AGI, the speculative project of a small cadre of immensely wealthy, global North-based men, to be of paramount importance and to outweigh justice and environmental issues that are existential for so many. That is the stance to which long-termist philosophers give their moral approval. So what's wrong with long-termism? Long-termism is at base a strain of the moral theory consequentialism. Long-termists, they tend to insist on their uncertainty about the correct moral theory. Still, they mostly lay out consequentialist arguments that equate value with well-being and so count as utilitarian doctrines. In doing so, they generally adopt a morally significant methodological practice, that is, presupposing that value is recognizable from a dispassionate point of view of the universe. This presupposition is morally substantial in seeming to enable us to treat well-being as a metric to compare value anywhere, not only across space to the global poor and across species to animals, but across time to those in the distant future. Now, in terms of philosophical classification, long-termism is a position in the field of population ethics, which comes from the work of philosopher Derek Parfit. Population ethics is a kind of inside game dealing with ethical conundrums that result from applying utilitarian modes of thought to future humans. The action turns on questions about whether claims to moral rightness reflect total aggregate well-being, average well-being, or well-being above a particular threshold, and so on. Long-termists index moral assessments to total aggregate well-being, despite recognizing that this stance, a form of total utilitarianism, entails what Parfit calls the repugnant conclusion. This is the conclusion that compared with a population whose members have a good quality of life, a population many times larger whose members live barely tolerable lives is morally preferable. Resisting the seemingly incontrovertible idea that their postures tie to this conclusion is a reductio, long-termists barrel on. Long-termist commitments imply that any situation in which 8 billion human beings lead meaningful, earthbound, democratic, and sustainable existences, living and dying for hundreds and thousands of years before peacefully going extinct, is worse, by orders of magnitude, than one in which trillions of post-humans live on into a distant cosmic future, leading barely tolerable lives. It appears it would be a supreme moral feat to lead humanity to the allegedly preferable outcome, and that if there are existential risks that could prevent this, it would be a supreme moral feat to reduce the likelihood of such threats, even by a fraction of a percentage. These projects seem significant enough to justify almost any steps, including steps resulting in mass, near-term suffering and mortality. That is long-termist moral logic. Hauntingly, it echoes the reasoning of fascist dictators and sci-fi villains like Thanos in the Marvel Universe, who aren't averse to mass death if it brings on futures they hail as utopia. This moral logic is long-termists' gift to AI leaders. Echoing their philosopher teachers, AI leaders tell us that AGI is humankind's bridge to utopian glory, and that building this bridge should be a or even the moral priority. Doomers add that unaligned AGI is likely the biggest threat to successful bridge crossing, and that neutralizing this threat, even minutely, is of paramount moral importance. All the while, there's doomer accelerationist agreement that AGI matters more than any injustices and harms for which it's responsible. Now, this is a travesty of moral reasoning. Long-term's failure as a moral theory is traceable to its consequentialist spine. Like other consequentialism-inflected theories, it slides into forms of welfarism that are conservative and simply presupposing existing social arrangements. This is because consequentialist doctrines lack the resources to assess complex social interventions directed towards transforming practices and institutions. Consequentialists' reliance on the God's eye method that seems to enable them to quantify and aggregate values anywhere prevents them from registering the sorts of iniquitous social circumstances that liberating social movements aim to change. Consider overlapping anti-racist, feminist, and indigenous rights movements engaged in struggle against social systems and structures that inflict physical, social, and emotional wounds and cause intergenerational setbacks. Many of the repeating injustices for which these movements seek redress are invisible apart from an appreciation of the history of the structures in question. The abstract quantitative methods of consequentialism-influenced theories are incapable of illuminating the structures in ways that reveal appropriate responses. Worse, such methods threaten to strengthen harmful social mechanisms, since one of the ways the mechanisms perpetuate themselves is through obfuscation that hides their workings. Because they're wedded to abstract methods, ethical approaches that incorporate consequentialist reasoning cannot avoid these liabilities. So long-termist approaches in ethics are a moral train wreck, and the wreckage extends to AI leaders' reliance on them. Projections of the total amount of digital well-being in an AGI-enabled utopian techno-future not only fail to show that it's right to neglect harms that developments in AI are causing right now, but obscure the circumstances that would enable us to judge what is demanded of us. The moral absolution that long-termism seems to offer AI leaders is an empty show. But notice that this takedown of AI companies' long-termist self-justifications doesn't depend on doubts about whether AI companies really are hastening towards AGI. A case for such doubts would be an additional critique, and it seems that such a case could be made. AGI is ill-defined, and even those most intent on it are, as Dario Amodei once put it, in the awkward position, we don't know what it's like. That was a quote. The rationale for investing hope in LLMs turns on thinking that these pure language models are candidates for natural language understanding, and as we all know now, LLMs can converse in ways that give the impression of intentional speech. But they manage this through sensitivity to the relative frequency of expressions in their databases. They have weaknesses in the areas of accuracy and causal reasoning that have been dramatized by studies showing they collapse when fed the output of other language models, and that figure in ongoing technical debates about whether natural language understanding will require a new approach to supply worldly grounding. Yet the industry is still organized largely around efforts to build bigger LLMs. Even if accuracy gains are made on this path, there's room for various philosophical worries related to the idea that the successful candidate machine will self-improve and begin a process of explosive technological growth. Here's one worry. Any such machine would presumably need to be endowed with agency, say with the ability to step back from impulses to believe or do particular things and ask whether it should believe or do those things. It's not clear why we should expect LLMs to become agential, or to use the term current in AI circles, agentic. Those committed to the current race to AGI are entitled to observe that complex systems sometimes have novel emergent features. But if talk of AGI's imminence is based on the hope of such features, it appears that this talk is much closer to an article of faith, a sort of religious fervor, than it is to scientific discourse. So, long-termist apologies for the AGI arms race are morally empty, ideological disguises for the self-enriching efforts of a small number of individuals to build larger LLMs. There is no excuse for overlooking the harms of this doubly defective, globally damaging enterprise. And before concluding, I want to devote a few minutes to giving you an impression of the nature and the scope of these harms. In 2018, Eritrean Stanford-educated computer scientist Timnit Gebru moved from Microsoft to Google, where she would, for a few years, co-lead the company's ethical AI team, charged with keeping AI products from perpetuating racism or other discriminatory practices. A few years earlier, Gebru had read a groundbreaking ProPublica study showing some AI tools used to assess the risk criminal offenders would reoffend were systematically biased against Black people. While at Microsoft, Gebru also worked on an important study on race-based discrimination in facial recognition technology. At Google, Gebru began to focus on LLMs. After a few years at the company, she agreed to work with her Google ethical AI co-lead, Margaret Mitchell, and others on problems related to the increasingly large and less discriminated data sets on which the models rely, and to co-write a paper describing how bias is perpetuated by standard methods for managing these data sets. The authors underline problems with reliance on sites like Reddit, Wikipedia, and Twitter, the content of which is mostly created by men, with a complementary neglect of small oppositional blogging sites, and with filtering out as unintelligible, fledgling, or very local liberating idioms. The upshot is, they write, that white supremacist and misogynist, ageist, etc. views are overrepresented in the training data, not only exceeding their prevalence in the general population, but also setting up models trained on these data sets to further amplify biases and harms. Some harms are simple functions of recreating hegemonic outlooks, sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes in clearly damaging ways involving hate speech, microaggressions, and dehumanization. There are also issues with injuries that result when LLMs or word embeddings from them are used as components of systems for classification for other tasks, job selection, loan assessment. Yet a further type of problem arises when bad actors use LLMs to generate conspiracy theories and recruit extremists. All these problems, Gebru and her co-author stress, can be addressed with thoughtful practices of curation, documentation, and accountability, but if unaddressed, LLMs will injure and further marginalize socially exposed populations. After Gebru's collaborative study sailed through ordinary approval channels at Google, a company vice president reached out to her to say that there were problems with it. Gebru was told either to retract the article or to take her name and those of her Google colleagues off of it. When she countered that she would do so only if the objections to the study and the names of those making them were revealed, she was effectively fired. Mitchell was fired 3 months later. Today, their collaborative study has a canonical study in the field of responsible AI. More harms. The construction and running of LLMs has substantial environmental cost. To support progressively larger LLMs, AI companies build sprawling data processing centers, some bigger than the campuses of the largest US Ivy League universities or bigger than Central Park, sorry for the US references. These are mineral-intense endeavors using significant amounts of copper and lithium, and they require enormous amounts of water that is potable and so clean enough to avoid clogging pipes and bacterial growth. Yet around 20% of the campuses are built in places with stressed watersheds. By 2027, their combined water use is projected to surpass that of all of Denmark. These data centers consume colossal amounts of energy. In recent years, tech giants have increasingly hid their models' technical details, making it hard to estimate and track their carbon footprints. But it's clear that these footprints are growing. In April 2025, the International Energy Agency estimated that by 2030, data processing centers would need as much energy as Japan today, effectively adding a whole new industrial nation onto the grid. The environmental impact of LLMs, like the technology's other harms, falls most heavily on already vulnerable populations. This won't shock anyone familiar with research on environmental racism. It is, Gebru and her co-authors observe, well documented that the negative effects of climate change are reaching and impacting the world's most marginalized communities first. There's a further related story to be told about the eugenic roots of the transhumanist tradition from which long-termism stems. No one familiar with this story will be surprised about long-termists' willingness to represent as morally justified practices that inflict inordinate harms on marginalized people the world over. And this brings me to a really brief conclusion with 2 philosophical morals. The first one is incredibly basic, but somehow important. The story of long-termism is partly a tale about how money, in the form of fancy research institutes, jobs, titles, book endorsements, publicity budgets, and ties to elite universities and governments, has given shoddy and catastrophically damaging ideas a foothold among philosophers. This tale's basic yet elusive moral is that worldly appeal doesn't reliably indicate good ideas and can mask bad ones. Second moral. Long-termism's story is also partly a tale about the many lives of utilitarianism. In 1961, Iris Murdoch declared, "There should have been a revolt against utilitarianism. For many reasons, it has not taken place." There are well-known normative critiques of utilitarianism, such as the one John Rawls advanced in 1971 when he wrote that in aggregating value, utilitarians fail to take seriously the distinction between persons. The point Murdoch made a decade earlier, it's consistent with Rawls, but it cuts deeper. She was struck by the fact that there had been in Anglo-American philosophical circles no sustained critical reflection on the metaphysical and epistemological assumptions that modern utilitarian thinkers take for granted. This observation remains true today, and it bears directly on the long-termism AI saga. Murdoch's critical ire is directed towards an entrenched metaphysical outlook, taken for granted not only by utilitarians, but by rights theorists like Rawls, on which reality is bereft of moral value. This is the metaphysic, a signature of European modernity and a cornerstone of contemporary analytic philosophy that treats the world as indefinitely extractable, instrumentalizable, and commodifiable. One of the great insights of Murdoch's work is that we need to question a value-neutral metaphysic if we're to grasp challenges of getting our worldly circumstances into view in a manner suitable for ethics. We fail to get these things into view if we succumb to the pressure exerted by the metaphysics and cheered on by long-termists to survey the world from a supposed standpoint of the universe. What is required instead is an openness to the prospect of a value-laden world that's accessible only to thought that explores historical, cultural, ecological, and other evaluative perspectives and assesses their cognitive power. That is the kind of demanding thought required to register the gravity of the structural racist, ableist, and sexist injuries, as well as of the devastating environmental harms that major AI companies, abetted by long-termism, are inflicting. It is the kind of demanding thought we need if we are to arrive at the social theoretical tools needed for formulating an appropriate political response to big AI's awful enthusiasm, now on lurid display in the US, for dismantling democratic institutions, accommodating fascist politics, and building network states in which capital is free to exploit workers and ravage the earth. Thank you.